Welcome to Nocturnal Knowledge. Today, we're exploring the history detailed in How to Survive in Ancient Greece by Robert Garland. Settle in as we journey through the pivotal events and figures that shaped our world. If you enjoy this exploration, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more deep dives into history's most compelling stories. Our journey begins now.
The city and its surroundings, Athens, Attica, and Piraeus. To truly understand life in classical Athens, we must look beyond the famed Acropolis and the bustling Agora. Athens as a polis was not merely the city itself, but also its surrounding territory, known as Attica. This elongated, carrot-shaped region, spanning roughly 1,000 square miles, formed the backbone of Athenian existence, providing sustenance and shaping its destiny. Attica's landscape was one of agricultural sustenance, while the urban center of Athens was compact, more akin to a provincial town by modern standards than a sprawling metropolis. Farm animals were an ever-present sight even within the city walls. Passageways between houses were narrow and winding, the roads themselves mostly unpaved, turning to dust in summer and mud in winter. The total population of Attica was around 150,000 souls, with half residing within the city and the other half scattered across the countryside. A stark reality, however, was that approximately half of this population were slaves, a condition they would likely maintain throughout their lives. This is crucial to remember, as Greek slavery, unlike its Roman counterpart, was not generally based on racial distinctions, meaning enslavement could befall anyone through circumstance, most commonly capture in war. The heart of this expansive polis was the city of Athens itself, a walled settlement pierced by numerous gates. The formidable walls, erected after the Persian departure in 480 BCE, utilized the very remnants of the temples and statues the invaders had destroyed. Crucially, Athens was linked to its vital coastal city, Piraeus, by the formidable Long Walls. These impressive fortifications, some 200 meters apart, ensured a secure connection to the sea. And what a connection it was! Piraeus, the second largest city in Attica, was far more than just a port. It was the premier trading hub of the classical world and the base of Athens' formidable naval might. With its 3 natural harbors, the most notable being the goblet-shaped Goblet, Piraeus handled the vast flow of imports and exports that fueled Athenian prosperity and imperial ambition. The Athenians took immense pride in their public buildings, and nowhere was this more evident than in the spectacular temples adorning the Acropolis. Acropolis literally means high part of the city, referring to the imposing rock crowned with an artificially leveled platform that still dominates the Athenian skyline. Among these temples, the Parthenon, dedicated to Athena Parthenos, or Athena the Maiden, stood as a breathtaking testament to Athens' preeminence. Within its walls housed a magnificent cult statue of the goddess, a colossal 12-meter figure gilded and adorned with silver over a sculpted wooden core. Other monumental structures, like the Propylaea, the grand entrance gateway, further emphasized the city's civic pride and architectural prowess. Yet, in stark contrast to this public magnificence, private dwellings offered little hint of ostentatious wealth, even for the city's affluent. Even the wealthiest Athenians lived frugally by modern standards, with their homes appearing somewhat run down when juxtaposed with the grandeur of their public edifices. This disparity, however, speaks to a profound sense of civic pride. When a rich vein of silver was discovered at Laurium in southern Attica in 483 BCE, the Athenians chose to invest this windfall in constructing a fleet, rather than distributing it as a general handout or tax cut, as we might expect today. Later, surplus tribute from their allies would be channeled into rebuilding the damaged Acropolis. Life within the city revolved around the agora, the open space that served as the civic, legal, and commercial nexus of the community. The Athenian agora, situated north of the Acropolis, was a male-dominated domain. Women were generally discouraged from entering unless they were retailers. The agora was characterized by its stoas, colonnaded structures offering shelter from the elements, where business deals were struck, and bankers plied their trade from their tables, the Greek word for bank, trapeza, literally meaning table. The law courts were also found here, with cases heard in the open before large juries, designed to deter bribery. Athens was a remarkably litigious society, with courts sitting for around 200 days a year, nearly every day not occupied by a state festival. The western side of the agora featured bronze statues of the 10 eponymous heroes who lent their names to the 10 Athenian tribes, serving as a public notice board. Nearby stood the Tholos, a circular building where 50 members of the Council of 500 from one tribe dined at public expense while deliberating. 17 of these counselors even remained overnight, ensuring a constant presence for emergencies. The council's duty was to prepare the assembly's agenda and debate issues beforehand. The agora was a vibrant commercial hub, attracting merchants from across the Aegean. It was also a place for social interaction, for chatting and exchanging gossip, which is encapsulated by the verb agorazine, meaning to loaf about in the agora. Groups with shared interests or origins would find their preferred meeting spots, and the Stoa of Attalus would later become a gathering place for philosophers. The very fabric of Athenian society was woven from its citizenry, between 30,000 and 50,000 free-born males whose parents were both Athenians. This body, known as the demos, wielded absolute power in Athens' radical, direct democracy. There were no formal governments or opposition parties, no prime ministers or presidents, and crucially, no elections. Every significant state decision was put to a vote in the assembly, essentially a perpetual referendum. All citizens enjoyed equality before the law and were judged by juries of their peers. Military service was a cornerstone of citizenship, with those who could afford armor serving as heavily armed hoplites, while the less affluent served as rowers in the Athenian powerful fleet. Athens, unique in the Greek-speaking world, was remarkably open to foreigners, known as medics. Tens of thousands resided within its borders, many in Piraeus, engaging in trade and contributing significantly to Athenian culture, while they hailed from across the Greek world and beyond, including Phoenicia and Egypt. They could not own property. Nevertheless, their talents were valued, and they were permitted to participate in major festivals and serve in the military or navy, free to return to their homelands if they chose. This cosmopolitanism, coupled with a deep-seated civic pride and a willingness to invest in public works, defined Athens and its surroundings, painting a picture of a dynamic, though certainly not without its hardships, society.
Daily life in the agora, the heart of the city. Welcome to the bustling heart of classical Athens, the agora. This is not merely a marketplace, it is the vibrant, pulsating center of civic, legal, and commercial life, the very nucleus of the city. Step on to its expansive open ground, and you'll immediately feel the energy of a society where public life is paramount. The agora is a place primarily for men. While women might enter, it's generally for specific purposes, most notably if they are retailers bringing their wares to market. For the Athenian male citizen, however, the agora is a daily destination. It's where business deals are struck, where the law is debated and dispensed, and where news and gossip are exchanged with an urgency that belies the absence of instant communication. Shelter from the Athenian sun and the elements is provided by the stoa, those distinctive colonnaded structures that line the perimeter of the agora. Within their shaded embrace, bankers set up their tables, or trapezai, the very word for bank in both ancient and modern Greek, underscoring the agora's role as the city's financial hub. Here, amidst the constant flow of people, fortunes are made and fortunes are discussed. Justice is also meted out in the open air. Law courts are scattered throughout the agora, with juries often comprising hundreds, sometimes over 600 citizens. This massive scale is a deliberate measure, intended to thwart bribery and ensure that decisions reflect the collective will of the citizenry. Given that Athenian courts sit for around 200 days a year, with trials often concluding within a single afternoon, the legal dramas of the agora are a constant feature of daily life. On the western side of the agora, you'll find a significant monument, a row of life-sized bronze statues of the 10 eponymous heroes. These figures, who lent their names to the 10 tribes into which the Athenian citizenry is divided, stand sentinel over a notice board. Here, all public business is announced, from decrees of the assembly to invitations to religious festivals. Nearby, the tholos, a circular building, serves as a communal dining hall and resting place for 50 members of the Council of 500. 50 councillors, drawn by lot, are fed and housed at public expense while they deliberate on the state's affairs, ensuring a constant presence to manage the state's business. The agora is also a commercial powerhouse. At dawn, retailers set up their temporary stalls, offering everything from agricultural produce to manufactured goods. Merchants from across the Aegean converge here, making Athens' agora the premier market in the classical Greek world. The very act of loafing about in the agora, agorazein, captures the essence of its social function. It's a place to connect, to converse, and to form groups based on shared interests or origins. Even philosophers, like the Stoics who would later gather in the painted stoa, find their intellectual homes here, debating the nature of virtue and the cosmos. In essence, the agora is Athens made visible. It's where democracy is practiced, where commerce thrives, and where the very fabric of Athenian society is woven, day in and day out. To understand Athens is to understand its agora.
Navigating Athenian society, citizens, medics, and slaves. Athens, the jewel of classical Greece, pulsates with life. But beneath the surface of its vibrant democracy and towering temples lies a complex social stratification. Understanding these distinctions is paramount to navigating this new world. At the apex of this structure are the citizens. To be a citizen of Athens means you are a free-born male whose parents were both Athenian citizens. This lineage grants you the invaluable right to participate directly in the city's governance. You are part of the demos, the people, who hold absolute power, voting on every significant state decision in the assembly. Citizenship carries a weighty responsibility.
Military service is mandatory, with obligations ranging from serving as a hoplite, the heavily armed infantryman, to rowing in the powerful Athenian navy if you lack the means for a full suit of armor. You're expected to be an active participant in civic life, attending the assembly, serving on the Council of 500, and engaging in constant discussion about the affairs of state in the agora. Citizenship isn't merely a status, it's a full-time commitment to the life of the polis. However, Athens' embrace extends beyond its citizens. The city is remarkable for its openness to foreigners, hosting perhaps as many as 20,000 so-called metics. These are resident aliens, individuals who hail from other Greek poli or even beyond the Hellenic world, bringing with them diverse talents and perspectives. Many metics reside in the bustling port of Piraeus, engaging primarily in trade and commerce, and their contributions are vital to Athens' economic vitality and cultural richness. While they cannot own land, they are permitted to worship their own deities and participate in crucial Athenian festivals like the Panathenaea. It is crucial for you, as a newcomer, to register as a metic within a month of your arrival with the eponymous archon. Failure to do so can result in deportation or even enslavement. While generally free from prejudice, particularly outside of the brief, tumultuous period of the 30 tyrants, metics must be aware that marriage to an Athenian citizen is discouraged, and their offspring will not inherit citizenship. At the very bottom of this social hierarchy are the slaves. Slavery is an intrinsic part of Athenian society. Indeed, roughly half of the city's population are slaves. Their conditions vary enormously. Domestic slaves, often treated with a degree of humanity and integrated into the household, are generally better off than those toiling in the silver mines of Laurium or marble quarries where conditions are notoriously harsh and dangerous. It's important to understand that Athenian slavery is not racially based. Anyone could become enslaved, typically through capture in war or kidnapping. This means that a slave's appearance may not immediately betray their status, a crucial point to remember as you navigate the streets. While abhorrent by our standards, for some, slavery offered a degree of security denied to the poorest freeborn citizens, who faced constant uncertainty about their next meal. Aristotle famously described a household slave as property that breathes, a chilling testament to the dehumanizing nature of the institution. Despite the legal framework permitting abuse, it's not uncommon for masters to develop relationships with their slaves, recognizing that humane treatment can foster better work. However, the stark reality is that slaves lack legal protection, and their lives are largely at the whim of their owners. The divisions within Athenian society are stark. While a middle class exists, the primary divide is between the wealthy and the poor. Wealth in classical Athens is less about material luxury as we understand it, and more about conspicuous display and patronage. The wealthy may own larger houses, more slaves, and enjoy a better diet, often including meat and fish daily, a significant privilege. They can afford to finance public works like equipping a trireme or mounting a dramatic production, gaining immense prestige through these liturgy. Yet even the wealthy live without modern amenities like running water or central heating. The poor, by contrast, often subsist on small land holdings, performing manual labor. Many benefit from state pay, serving as rowers in the navy or as jurors, a crucial source of income, especially for the elderly. Women's lives are largely circumscribed by the home, with their primary roles centered around household management and child-rearing. While respectable women are expected to remain socially invisible, some, like the hetairai, female companions, carve out more public and educated lives, mixing in intellectual and political circles.
Welcome to Athenian lifestyle, from housing to waste disposal. As you step into this vibrant city, you'll quickly realize that life here operates on a rhythm quite different from our own. From the very foundations of your dwelling to the unseen currents of daily refuse, the Athenian way of life is an intricate tapestry woven from practical necessity deeply held beliefs, and the unique civic spirit. Your new home, or oikos, is likely to be a modest dwelling, often constructed from mud brick and topped with a tiled roof. While the grand temples on the Acropolis speak of immense civic pride and artistic achievement, private homes, even those of the well-to-do, tend to be far more restrained in appearance. Expect flat roofs, 2 stories at most, and simple construction. Walls might be plastered, but security is a relative concept. Thieves could, and often did, burrow through them. Inside, a central hearth would provide warmth and a place for cooking, with smoke escaping through a hole in the roof. There are no chimneys here. Windows, if they exist, are shuttered, not glazed, meaning interiors can be dim and smoky, especially during colder months. Artificial light comes from small lamps burning animal fat, casting a flickering, intimate glow. Furniture is sparse, a wooden bed for the more affluent, while others would recline on the floor, perhaps on mats or straw. You'll find a few chairs, a stool or 2, a small table, and a chest for belongings. Hooks on the walls might hold items, and a shelf would likely display your pottery. If you possess a courtyard, you might find a small mud brick altar for daily sacrifices to household deities. For the more prosperous, a storehouse for grain would be a common feature. Farm animals, too, were not uncommon sights within built-up areas. The very concept of home and house in Greek is captured by the word oikos or oikia. This term, however, is broader than our modern understanding, encompassing not just the physical structure and its inhabitants, but also the land, livestock, and all movable property, including slaves. It's a holistic unit, reflecting a society where property and people are intrinsically linked. Navigating the city streets, you'll notice a stark contrast between public and private spaces. The Athenian agora, the bustling heart of civic, legal, and commercial life, is a place for men to conduct business, argue legal cases before large juries, and engage in social discourse. Stoas, those sheltered colonnades, offer refuge from the sun and weather, serving as the open-air offices for bankers and merchants. The agora is also where public notices are displayed and civic life unfolds. Yet outside this vibrant public sphere, the streets themselves can be quite a challenge. Passageways between houses are narrow and winding. Most roads are simply beaten earth, dusty in the dry season and muddy when it rains. This brings us to a rather pungent aspect of Athenian life: waste disposal. Holding your nose will become a necessary habit. Piles of refuse are a common sight on street corners, and the stench, especially in summer, can be overwhelming. While a large drain, optimistically dubbed the Great Drain, runs through the agora, it's largely inadequate for the sheer volume of filth tossed into it, and it frequently dries up in the heat. When heavy rains do occur, infected sewage often runs through the streets. Dung collectors are employed to haul away refuse, but they are required to deposit it at least half a mile outside the city walls. Despite the efforts of appointed officials to maintain cleanliness, the sheer scale of the task means that waste disposal is largely left to individual discretion. This concern for cleanliness, while perhaps not driven by our modern germ theory, is linked to a deep-seated fear of miasma, or pollution, seen as an invisible contagion. This fear is why the dead are not buried within the city walls. Contact with a corpse is believed to be a potent source of this pollution, requiring ritual purification. In essence, Athenian life, while offering a remarkable intellectual and artistic flourishing, demands a certain resilience. The urban environment is a sensory experience, the sounds of commerce, the chatter in the agora, but also the unavoidable odors of a city still grappling with the complexities of managing its own waste. It's a world that requires adaptability, a willingness to engage with the immediate realities, and an acceptance of a very different standard of living than we might be accustomed to.
Women's roles and restrictions within and beyond the home. Life for women in ancient Athens, especially those considered respectable, was largely circumscribed by the domestic sphere. The fundamental unit of Athenian society was the oikos, or household, which encompassed not just people, but also property, slaves, and livestock. A woman's primary role was tied to this oikos, centered on managing the household and raising children. This demanding but essential work kept them largely within the confines of their homes. The societal view of women, as articulated by prominent figures like Aristotle, often portrayed them as inherently inferior to men. Aristotle famously described women as resembling an infertile male and attributed their supposed inadequacies to the coldness of her nature. This prejudiced outlook, unburdened by empirical knowledge, as anatomical science was absent due to religious taboos against dissection, shaped the limitations placed upon women. The father's role in procreation was considered paramount, with the mother often viewed as merely the nurse of the newly sown seed, a sentiment echoed in the works of playwrights like Aeschylus. Yet, with a striking lack of logic, men often attributed the failure to conceive to the woman, conveniently overlooking male sterility. Furthermore, a deep-seated belief existed that women were the originators of human misery, a notion personified in the myth of Pandora, whose curiosity unleashed all evils upon mankind. Consequently, women were expected to adhere to strict codes of behavior. Pericles, in his famous speech, articulated the ideal that a woman's greatest glory was to be talked about neither in praise nor in blame. This ideal of social invisibility meant that respectable women were discouraged from appearing in public unaccompanied. When they did venture out, modesty was paramount, requiring them to cover their faces and bodies with cloaks and veils. Their lives were largely dictated by the absence of their husbands, who were free to engage in public life, work, and social gatherings. For women, however, there were few socially acceptable outlets outside the home. The work undertaken by Greek women was predominantly within the domestic sphere. Textile manufacture, particularly tapestry weaving, was an occupation that brought considerable honor, but it was performed within the home. While arts and crafts were not strictly gender-specific, and vase painters could be female, these were exceptions. For women who found themselves widowed, the necessity of working for a living often increased as their previous support structures vanished. A unique and more liberated path was that of the hetera, or female companion. These women were the only ones permitted to attend symposia, or drinking parties, where they mingled in elite cultural, intellectual, and political circles. Their role required them to be educated and politically informed, often leading to considerable wealth. However, this was a professional outlet, a career path that excluded them from marriage. Women could also serve as priestesses and officiants, but these were select positions and hardly a common career path. Midwifery and wet nursing were other roles, though the latter was typically filled by slaves. Beyond the home, women's participation in public life was severely curtailed. They could not vote, serve on juries, initiate lawsuits, nor represent themselves in court. Inheritance laws also placed them at a disadvantage, as they could not inherit in their own name. Even attending the theater was likely restricted for respectable women. However, there were certain social outlets available. Festivals, particularly those from which men were excluded, offered opportunities for women to socialize. The Themosphorgia, a festival honoring Demeter, involved women retrieving the rotting flesh of pigs thrown into a fissure, offering a chance for them to leave the house and interact with other women, exchanging gossip amidst ritual. Funerals also provided a social outlet, as women prepared the bodies for burial and visited graves, an activity that sometimes facilitated clandestine relationships. The structure of marriage itself reinforced these restrictions. Husbands were typically much older than their wives, often by a decade or more. Girls married at the onset of puberty, maximizing their child-rearing capacity, though this practice often had detrimental health consequences. This age disparity contributed to a paternalistic dynamic in marriage, with husbands expected to tame their wives into conforming to their expectations of domestic conduct. Domestic abuse, though not openly discussed, was implicitly a reality, as illustrated by literary examples. In contrast to Athens, Spartan women experienced a somewhat different reality. They married later, closer in age to their husbands, and were treated more as equals. Spartan women were renowned for their strength of will and independence, being the only Greek women permitted to own property in their own name. Their upbringing focused on physical training and education in Spartan history and values, preparing them to be strong mothers who would bear resilient offspring, thus ensuring the continuation of the Spartan military ideal. Ultimately, life for women in ancient Athens was a complex interplay of domestic duty, societal expectations, and limited personal freedom. While their roles within the household were crucial for the functioning of the oikos, their lives beyond it were largely restricted, shaping their opportunities and their visibility in Athenian society.
In the heart of ancient Athens, the concept of the family was intrinsically linked to the idea of the household, or oikos. This term encompassed not just the people living under one roof, but also the property, the house, land, and all its possessions, including slaves. The continuity and prosperity of this oikos was paramount, and this duty fell primarily upon the male head of household. Marriage was a fundamental pillar of Athenian society, driven by the imperative to perpetuate the oikos through legitimate offspring, particularly male heirs. Consequently, Athenian girls were typically married upon reaching puberty or shortly thereafter. This practice, intended to maximize childbearing capacity, often had the opposite effect, as many young brides were biologically unprepared for childbirth, leading to significant health risks and shortened lifespans. While women's lives were largely confined to the domestic sphere, and respectable women were discouraged from appearing in public unaccompanied, the realities for women of lower social strata were different. Many were compelled to leave their homes for essential daily tasks, granting them a degree of freedom in public life that their wealthier counterparts lacked. The patriarchal structure of Athenian society dictated the lives of women. While not considered inherently dirty or polluted in the way some other cultures viewed them, women were often seen as physiologically inferior. Aristotle, for instance, described women as essentially infertile males,
their biology failing to produce semen in its perfect form due to their perceived coldness. This view, while perhaps not universally held, reflected a broader societal tendency to attribute the father's role in conception as more significant. This was further reinforced by the myth of Pandora, whose curiosity unleashed all evils upon humanity, positioning women as the originators of human misery. The double standard of Athenian morality was starkly evident in marital expectations. Husbands were generally free to engage in sexual relations with women outside the home, provided they were not freeborn Athenian women. Adultery on the part of a wife, however, was considered a serious offense, potentially leading to the production of illegitimate heirs and carrying severe legal penalties. A wife caught in the act could be killed by her husband, and if he failed to divorce her, he risked losing his citizenship. Adultery was deemed worse than rape, as it threatened the legitimacy of the lineage. The domestic sphere was managed by women, who were responsible for the household and the upbringing of children. Socially invisible, their greatest glory was to be spoken of neither in praise nor in blame. They were expected to be modest, to remain indoors, and to manage domestic duties such as spinning and weaving. These were vital contributions to the family's welfare, as exemplified by Penelope's famed weaving ruse in the Odyssey. While the constraints on women may seem stifling by modern standards, it's important to remember that seclusion also offered a degree of protection in a dangerous world. Festivals, though often the only permitted social outings, also provided opportunities for women to gather and share news. Childhood in Athens was considerably shorter than in modern Western societies, and the culture was not particularly child-oriented. Emotional well-being was not a primary parental concern, though affection was certainly present. Children largely played with siblings, and playdates or sleepovers were rare. Wealthier families relied on nurses for child-rearing, while poorer families expected children to contribute to labor as soon as they were able. Discipline was often harsh, with physical punishment being common. The education of children was largely the responsibility of parents. Girls received basic domestic training, while boys attended school from around age 7 to 14, learning reading, writing, and often music and poetry. The ability to read and write was essential for participation in the Athenian democracy. For the wealthy, education could be further supplemented by private tutors. The institution of slavery was pervasive in Athens, with most households owning at least one slave. Slaves performed a wide range of tasks, from domestic service to agricultural labor and work in mines and quarries. While the conditions varied greatly, with domestic slaves generally faring better than those in harsher labor, the system was inherently exploitative. Notably, Athenian slavery was not racially based, and any Greek was at risk of becoming enslaved through circumstances like capture in war. Philosophers like Aristotle even posited a concept of slaves by nature, implying a justification for their subjugation based on perceived anatomical or moral inferiority. Despite the abhorrent nature of slavery, it could, in some instances, offer a degree of security and sustenance denied to the poorest freeborn citizens. In essence, the Athenian family was a tightly structured unit centered on the oikos. Marriage was a contractual arrangement for procreation, and women, while essential to the household, were largely subordinate and confined to the domestic sphere. Children were raised with a focus on contributing to the family and state, and slavery permeated every level of society, underpinning the Athenian economy and way of life.
In the vibrant tapestry of classical Athens, a stark contrast existed between those who held vast wealth and those who struggled to subsist. This divide was not merely economic. It shaped daily life, social interactions, and even one's perception of the world. While the city boasted magnificent public buildings and a thriving intellectual life, the realities for its wealthiest citizens and its poorest were worlds apart. For the affluent, life offered a degree of comfort, though by modern standards, luxury was still limited. Their homes were larger, often inherited, and might feature separate quarters for women known as the gynaikonotis. They could afford better food, including meat and fish daily, a significant privilege. Wealth also manifested in possessions, finely decorated pottery reserved for drinking parties, prestigious funerary monuments, and the ultimate status symbol, horses. Owning a horse in mountainous Greece was akin to possessing a private jet today, serving purely as a display of status rather than practical transport. However, even the wealthiest lived without modern conveniences like running water or advanced heating. Their primary expenditure, beyond basic sustenance, was on slaves, who performed nearly all domestic and manual labor. Wealthy Athenians often financed public services known as liturgies, such as equipping warships or sponsoring theatrical productions. This was not just philanthropy. It was a public declaration of status, a form of conspicuous consumption designed to impress and gain influence. Some super-rich individuals might even run businesses, like silver mines, but they would delegate the actual management to trusted, educated slaves, keen to keep their own hands clean of direct commerce. In stark contrast, the lives of the poor were a constant negotiation with scarcity. While Athens' empire and the system of state pay for rowers and jurors provided some support, particularly for the elderly, most of the poor subsisted on small landholdings, farming for survival. Their diet was basic, relying heavily on bread, olive oil, vegetables, and legumes. Meat was a luxury, often only encountered during public festivals. Many poor women, particularly widows, were forced into manual labor, working as wet nurses, weavers, or grape pickers. Their lives precarious and their efforts deserving of sympathy and respect for the courage with which they faced such hardship. Reliance on relatives was common for many, both male and female, during times of difficulty. The evidence available heavily favors the perspective of the well-to-do, leaving the daily lives and struggles of the poor largely undocumented. Yet it is clear that upward social mobility was rare. Individuals were largely born into their social stratum and remained there throughout their lives, with enslavement through capture or kidnapping being the most significant exceptions. The political arena, while theoretically democratic, was also influenced by wealth. Aristocratic families, known as gene, wielded considerable influence, and the ability to finance public services offered a clear path to recognition and political engagement. The very concept of work was viewed differently by the Greeks. The word aschkolia comes closest, meaning absence of leisure. Leisure, from their perspective, was the natural state, made possible by the institution of slavery. Athenians disdained manual labor, particularly working for others. However, being a citizen was a demanding, full-time occupation. It involved constant participation in the assembly, service on various councils, military duty, religious observance, and active engagement in the affairs of one's local deme. Thus, even those without physical labor were kept busy through their civic responsibilities. The chasm between rich and poor
was a fundamental aspect of Athenian society, shaping its opportunities, its values, and the lived experience of its inhabitants. Understanding this divide is crucial to grasping the complex realities of life in classical Athens.
The plight and role of slaves in Athenian society. In the intricate tapestry of Athenian society, the lives of slaves were woven into its very fabric, yet they remained largely unseen and unheard, a stark contrast to the vibrant democracy and flourishing culture that defined the polis. While Athens boasted a remarkable era of human achievement, this progress was built upon a foundation where a significant portion of the population lived in bondage. Most Athenians, regardless of their own social standing, owned at least one slave. For the wealthy, these individuals were not merely property, but integral to the functioning of their households, performing a myriad of tasks from domestic chores to managing estates. The condition of a slave, however, varied dramatically. Those who toiled within the confines of the home generally experienced better treatment than those engaged in more arduous outside labor. Yet the absolute nadir was reserved for those who worked in the unforgiving conditions of the silver mines and marble quarries. Their lives were a constant struggle against back-breaking work, dangerous environments, and often a slow descent into early graves. The institution of slavery in Athens was not based on race or ethnicity. Unlike the chattel slavery of later eras, enslavement in Athens was largely a consequence of circumstance, primarily through capture in war or being kidnapped by pirates. This meant that a Greek citizen could, at any moment, find themselves on the other side of the master-slave dynamic. It also meant that distinguishing a slave from a free person by appearance alone was often impossible. The Athenian philosopher Aristotle, a keen observer of society, famously described a household slave as property that breathes, a chilling testament to the dehumanizing perspective that permeated Athenian thought. He even postulated that physical deformities, often resulting from the harshness of their labor, were indicators of an inherent moral and anatomical inferiority. This concept of slaves by nature distinguished them from those born free but later enslaved, a notion that blurred the lines between cause and effect and served to justify the existing social order. While Aristotle's view might have been extreme, it likely reflected a prevailing sentiment, suggesting that slaves, in the eyes of many Athenians, were barely considered human. But the stark reality of Athenian slavery offered a peculiar form of security that even some free-born citizens lacked. In a world fraught with danger and uncertainty, where daily laborers often faced precarious sustenance and no guaranteed employment, slaves received regular food and basic shelter. This existential security, however grim, was a trade-off for the profound loss of freedom and autonomy. The economic structure of Athens played a crucial role in maintaining this system. The tribute paid by Athens' maritime empire directly benefited many poor citizens, providing them with wages as rowers in the fleet or as jurors. This created a complex interdependence where the exploitation of one group enabled a degree of comfort and participation for another. It is important to remember that Athenian slavery, while abhorrent by modern standards, differed in some respects from other forms of bondage. The lack of a racial basis, for example,
meant that Greek identity itself was not inherently tied to freedom. Moreover, while abuse was pervasive and legal protections were minimal, the Athenian system did allow for the possibility of manumission, the act of freeing a slave, although this was rare. Some slaves, particularly those entrusted with financial matters or serving in skilled capacities like Passion the banker, could, through immense luck and capability, eventually earn their freedom. In essence, slaves in Athens were the unacknowledged engine of their society. They performed the labor that freed citizens to engage in politics, philosophy, and the arts. They were the silent workforce behind the gleaming temples and the intellectual discourse. Their plight was one of constant toil, limited rights, and a perpetual vulnerability. A stark reminder that the celebrated achievements of classical Athens came at a profound human cost, a cost borne by those who lived and died in the shadows of bondage.
Work and craftsmanship, the value of labor, or lack thereof. In the bustling heart of classical Athens, the concept of work carried a weight and connotation quite different from our modern understanding. The Greeks themselves didn't possess a direct equivalent for our word work. Instead, their closest term, aschkolia, meant the absence of leisure, a phrase that reveals much about their societal priorities. Leisure, from a Greek perspective, was considered the normal, ideal state of existence, while work, its antithesis, was viewed as abnormal. This societal outlook was fundamentally underpinned by the institution of slavery. With a significant portion of the population enslaved, the burden of manual labor and daily chores was largely removed from the shoulders of free citizens. Consequently, Athenians harbored a distinct disdain for what we consider work, particularly for labor performed for another. However, this does not mean Athenians were an idle populace. Far from it. The very essence of being an Athenian citizen was a demanding full-time occupation. It involved active participation in the assembly, service on the Council of 500, holding magistracies, performing military duty, participating in religious festivals, and serving on juries. Beyond these official duties, citizens were expected to engage in civic life through countless informal interactions, discussing matters of state in the agora or at symposia. Furthermore, one was not merely a citizen of Athens, but also a member of their local deme or township, each functioning as a miniature city-state with its own assemblies, regulations, and festivals. This constant civic engagement kept Athenians remarkably busy, often leaving them with little time spent at home. When we consider the types of work that were undertaken by those who were not citizens or were of lower status, a diverse picture emerges. Farming was the most common occupation, though often conducted on a small scale, focusing on essential cereals, grapes, and olives. The Aegean Sea, while providing sustenance, was not a rich fishing ground, so maritime endeavors were generally modest. Trade, however, was a significant sector, with many traders in Athens being metics, resident aliens who contributed immensely to the city's economic vitality. Craftsmanship was ubiquitous. Athenians excelled in a vast array of trades: stonemasons, carpenters, jewelers, cobblers, blacksmiths, weavers, potters, vase painters, house painters, fullers, rope makers, sail makers, builders, masons, dyers, sculptors, shoemakers, and sword manufacturers. The list is extensive. The term techne, meaning skill, was applied not only to artisans, but also to those who mastered professions like medicine and soothsaying. Crucially, in the ancient world, there was no rigid distinction between a craftsman
and an artist, nor between a humble artifact and a work of art. This blurring of lines contributed to a more democratic perception of skill and creation. Learning a craft typically began in childhood, with fathers often passing their trade to their sons. An Athenian law even decreed that a son who was not taught a skill by his father was not obliged to support him in old age. For fathers without sons, adoption or the purchase of a slave boy allowed for the continuation of their craft. This familial and societal transmission of skills was common across Greece. Working conditions varied dramatically. Many craftsmen operated small-scale workshops from their homes, employing a few assistants. However, some, particularly those involved in arms manufacturing, could employ over 100. While tasks like pottery or vase painting were relatively benign, sculpture was arduous, often requiring the supervision of quarrying. Blacksmiths, for instance, faced dangerous and unhealthy conditions due to furnace fumes. The absence of labor-saving devices meant that work was often physically demanding, with repetitive motions leading to deformities. Workers relied on the numerous festivals to provide respite from their toil. The status of those who worked, particularly manual laborers and craftsmen, was often a source of social prejudice. Aristocracy derived their wealth from land ownership and looked down on those they categorized as banausio, or mechanics. Philosophers like Aristotle claimed that the life of a craftsman was an ignoble and inimical to virtue, believing that constant labor left no time for higher pursuits. This prejudice was amplified by the fact that craftsmen sometimes worked alongside slaves, a situation noted even among the sculptors of the Parthenon. However, despite this societal disdain, many craftsmen took immense pride in their accomplishments. The practice of potters and painters signing their work suggests a significant level of self-esteem, though the modern cult of the artist, with its emphasis on originality, was absent. Craftsmen were expected to emulate, not innovate, beyond their predecessors. Itinerant specialists with highly valued skills, such as physicians, architects, and bards, were highly respected and sought after, often being described as being invited from the ends of the earth. The value placed on leisure, the omnipresence of slavery, and the demanding nature of civic participation all shaped the Athenian experience of work. While manual labor was often looked down upon, the active engagement of citizens in the affairs of their polis was considered a paramount duty and the true measure of a man.
Health and hygiene, the realities of ancient medicine and disease. Life in classical Athens, while vibrant and intellectually stimulating, presented a significant challenge to one's physical well-being. Compared to the modern world, the ancient environment was considerably harsher on the body, not just due to the natural aging process, which was far more rapid, but critically due to the prevalence of disease and the rudimentary nature of medical understanding. Classical Greece was a hotbed for a multitude of viral diseases. Meningitis, measles, mumps, scarlet fever, and smallpox were all rife. In densely populated urban centers like Athens, where efficient waste disposal and access to uncontaminated water were constant struggles, diseases such as cholera and typhus were common. The city lacked hospitals and any effective means of isolating individuals suffering from communicable diseases. Crucially, there was a profound lack of understanding regarding how germs spread and caused illness. This was starkly illustrated at the beginning of the Peloponnesian War, when Athens experienced a devastating plague. The influx of the rural population into the city walls to escape the invading Spartan army dramatically increased the population density.
The plague carried off an estimated 1/3 of Athens' population and left an equal percentage disfigured and disabled. While this plague was remarkable for its virulence, it was far from an isolated event. Should you find yourself falling ill, the decision to consult a physician was not one readily made by the majority. Only a small fraction of the population possessed the financial means to afford a physician's services. For most, recourse was to herbal remedies, often gathered and prepared at home. Even when a physician was consulted, there was no guarantee of improvement. Sometimes a physician's intervention could exacerbate the condition. Back pain, for instance, could be met with treatments such as being violently shaken or thrown into the air. A popular medical procedure was bloodletting, based on the theory of the four humors, black bile, yellow bile, blood, and water, derived from Hippocrates, the esteemed founder of rational medicine. The aim was to restore balance within the body by removing excess blood. An alternative, and for many, a more accessible recourse for illness, was to seek out the numerous sanctuaries dedicated to Asclepius, the god of healing. His sanctuaries, such as the prominent one in Epidaurus and another in the Piraeus, drew hundreds of individuals suffering from all manner of ailments. These sanctuaries were places of immense human misery, with the sick lying on stretchers or hobbling about on crutches, all hoping for a divine intervention. At night, they would sleep in dormitories, praying for a dream visit from Asclepius. If fortunate enough to have such a vision, they would recount it to a sanctuary attendant, who would help interpret the god's message. Even a skeptical Athenian woman named Ambrosia, who initially scoffed at the inscribed tales of cures, was reportedly humbled and healed after the god appeared to her in a dream, instructing her to dedicate a silver pig as an acknowledgement of her piggish stupidity. Importantly, these sanctuaries did not solely rely on faith healing. Physicians often practiced scientific medicine within their grounds, and archaeological evidence reveals surgical instruments, indicating that operations on various parts of the body were performed. For minor complaints, it was advisable to keep a personal stock of herbs, drugs, and salves at home. While no modern equivalent to the pill existed, a method of contraception involved crushing Queen Anne's lace, or Daucus carota, and mixing it with diluted wine. The medical school at Kos, established by Hippocrates, believed that health and sickness were determined by the balance of the four humors. Physicians in this tradition aimed to correct and maintain this balance. They were also skilled in setting bones and performing surgery, including the grim procedure of removing a stillborn baby from the womb in dire circumstances. Hippocratic physicians emphasized building patient trust and favored natural remedies, often believing in letting nature take its course. They meticulously recorded daily accounts of disease progression, believing that even in death, documenting symptoms could aid future medical discoveries. Crucially, Hippocratic physicians vehemently opposed the notion that diseases were caused by the gods, ascribing them to natural explanations. While acknowledging the role of faith in healing and encouraging patients to pray to Asclepius, these physicians were also aware of the prevalence of quackery, a problem Hippocrates sought to combat by requiring his followers to take a sacred oath that included principles of medical confidentiality, judicious surgery, and refraining from providing poison. The overall physical condition of an Athenian was likely to be one of persistent aches and pains, regardless of age. Broken bones might never have been properly set, leading to chronic pain and limping. Without analgesics, enduring such discomfort was a necessity.
The rapid aging process in the ancient world, exacerbated by factors such as undernourishment, overwork, poor hygiene, and prevalent diseases, meant that adulthood often brought with it chronic ailments and disabilities. Deafness and blindness were frequent consequences of aging, with no technological aids like hearing aids or corrective lenses available. Dental health was abysmal, with decay, tooth loss, and wear being widespread. A seemingly minor injury like a broken leg could result in permanent disability and the end of one's working life. Archaeological evidence indicates that approximately 10% of ancient Greek skeletons show evidence of fractures. Life expectancy was significantly shorter than today. While precise figures are difficult to ascertain, women could expect to live into their mid-30s and men into their mid-40s. Reaching 80 was an exceptional achievement. This disparity was largely due to factors such as boys generally receiving better nourishment and girls often becoming pregnant shortly after menarche, followed by rapid successive births which debilitated their bodies. The age structure of Athenian society was heavily skewed towards youth. Much larger proportion of the population was under 40 than in modern societies, and conversely, far fewer people lived beyond that age. Achieving old age was a notable accomplishment, and while respect for elders was a cultural ideal, the reality for the poor, elderly, or infirm was a precarious one. Without state pensions or extensive family support, survival often depended on continued, albeit limited work, such as jury service, or relying on the goodwill of relatives. The very concept of retirement was rare, as most individuals worked until they were physically unable to.
The gods and the afterlife, piety, ritual, and the world beyond. In the vibrant, often chaotic world of classical Athens, the divine was not a distant concept, but an ever-present force woven into the very fabric of daily life. For the Athenians, the gods were not abstract moral exemplars, but powerful, anthropomorphic beings, prone to human-like emotions and susceptible to influence. Understanding their nature, appeasing their moods, and navigating their divine will was paramount for survival and prosperity. The Athenian pantheon was vast, populated by a fractious yet formidable family of Olympians residing on Mount Olympus. At their head stood Zeus, the king of the gods, whose thunderbolt symbolized his supreme, though not absolute, power. Alongside him were deities like Hera, goddess of marriage, Poseidon, lord of the seas, Hades, ruler of the underworld, Athena, protector of Athens and goddess of wisdom and warfare, Ares, the brutal god of war, Hermes, the swift messenger and god of commerce, Demeter, the nurturer of the harvest, Dionysus, god of wine and revelry, Aphrodite, goddess of love and beauty, Artemis, the huntress, Apollo, god of music, healing, and prophecy, and Hephaestus, the lame craftsman. Each deity held dominion over specific aspects of the cosmos and human endeavor, and their favor could be sought for a multitude of reasons. But the divine realm extended beyond the Olympian heights. The chthonic deities, those dwelling beneath the earth, commanded immense power, particularly in matters of vengeance and the underworld. Their presence was often felt through more potent and sometimes terrifying manifestations. Equally significant was the worship of heroes, individuals whose lives, for good or ill, had been exceptional. These heroes, powerful in the vicinity of their graves, could be invoked for aid in times of crisis. Piety, the Greeks' term for devotion to the gods, was not about adhering to a strict moral code,
but about active engagement with the divine. This engagement was primarily expressed through ritual and sacrifice. Observance was conducted in the open, around altars, with temples serving primarily as residences for the cult statues of the gods. The gods, being anthropomorphic, found pleasure in the scent of roasting animals offered in sacrifice, and in witnessing human excellence displayed in contests of athleticism and skill, which were frequently incorporated into their festivals. The role of the priest was not one of spiritual guidance, but of overseeing sanctuaries and supervising observances. These positions were not vocational, but often held by citizens for a limited term, their appointment determined by gender, heredity, or even the ability to pay for the privilege. The most prominent priesthood in Athens was that of Athena Polias, held by a priestess drawn from a venerable kin group, yet without direct political influence due to her gender. To gain the gods' favor, you had two primary avenues: making a votive dedication or performing a sacrifice. Votive dedications could range from simple terracotta figurines to elaborate bronze statues, offered as tokens of gratitude or pleas for assistance. Sacrifices, often of animals, were accompanied by prayers, where individuals would remind the deity of past favors or offerings. The generosity of the offering was believed to correlate with the likelihood of divine attention. Libations of wine, honey, or milk were also common offerings. Every god had a designated day in the calendar, and their birthdays were marked by significant state sacrifices. For Athena, on her birthday month of Hecatombeon, the state sacrificed 300 oxen. The very act of sacrifice, or thuin in Greek, literally meant to make smoke, as the savory smoke of the burning offerings was believed to ascend to the gods. Competitions, such as the Panathenaian Games, were also held in honor of Athena, with prizes like amphoras filled with olive oil, Athens' staple export. Interpreting signs from the gods was a crucial aspect of Greek life. Seers, who considered themselves descendants of Apollo, specialized in deciphering oracular utterances, divine messages often presented in obscure or ambiguous terms. The famous oracle at Delphi, considered the navel of the earth, famously advised the Athenians to trust the wooden wall before the Persian invasion, a prophecy misinterpreted by many as a reference to the Acropolis's wooden fence rather than the Athenian fleet. The ability to interpret oracles required not only foresight but also insight, as the adage, "Know thyself," inscribed at Delphi emphasized. Disregard for oracles or their misinterpretation could lead to dire consequences, as illustrated by the story of the Athenian generals who postponed their retreat from Sicily due to an eclipse, a sign interpreted as divine disapproval of departure. The Greeks believed that virtually everyone ended up in Hades, the kingdom of the dead, ruled by its namesake, god Hades, also known as Pluto. To reach Hades, the dead had to cross the river Styx, ferried by Charon for a fee, typically an obol placed in the mouth of the deceased. Hades was depicted as a dark, damp, and drafty realm. Unlike some other belief systems, there was no posthumous judgment for the wicked or reward for the virtuous, unless you achieved immortal glory as a warrior, in which case Elysium or the Isles of the Blessed awaited. Conversely, egregious offenses against the gods could result in eternal torment in Tartarus. The ties between the living and the dead remained strong. The dead were seen as dependent on the living for attention, and regular visits to graves with food, drink, and offerings were common. Family ties were believed to endure in the afterlife, offering a crumb of comfort in the murky darkness of Hades, although the prospect of encountering one's enemies also existed. The high incidence of death among the young and the brevity of life cast a pall over Greek society, with grave monuments often commemorating young individuals who died unmarried, never having reached the age of marriage. In essence, Athenian religious life was a dynamic, practical engagement with a pantheon of powerful, capricious deities. Piety was demonstrated through consistent ritual, careful observance of omens, and a constant effort to understand and align oneself with the will of the gods, for their favor was seen as indispensable for navigating the unpredictable currents of life and death in the ancient Greek world.
Navigating the unknown, oracles, prophecy, and divine intervention. Life in ancient Athens, for all its intellectual and artistic ferment, was deeply intertwined with the divine. Decisions, both personal and public, were often guided or at least influenced by what the gods might decree. To navigate this world, Athenians looked to oracles, sought omens, and performed rituals, all in an effort to understand and influence the will of their often capricious deities. The most renowned center for seeking divine guidance was the Oracle of Apollo at Delphi, considered by the Greeks to be the very navel of the earth. Reaching this sacred site was no simple matter, often involving arduous travel, either by land or sea, and then a significant wait in line. Petitioners would submit their questions to the god through a priestess, known as the Pythia, who would deliver an oracular utterance. These pronouncements, however, were rarely straightforward. They were often cryptic, deliberately obscure, and occasionally outright misleading, as King Croesus of Lydia famously discovered when an oracle led him to believe he would destroy a great empire, only for him to unknowingly destroy his own. The Athenian encounter with the wooden wall oracle, instructing them to trust in this safeguard against the Persian invasion, serves as a stark warning. While professional seers interpreted it as a reference to the Acropolis's dilapidated wooden fence, leading to a massacre of defenders, the true meaning, as the astute Themistocles realized, was the Athenian fleet, a wooden wall of ships that ultimately secured their victory. This underscores the crucial need for intelligence and insight when interpreting an oracle. As the inscription at Delphi wisely stated, "Know thyself, for foresight is of little use without self-awareness." Beyond Delphi, professional seers were also available within Athens, offering their interpretations of prophecies, meteorological phenomena, and even the flight of birds. A sneeze at the opportune or inopportune moment could be seen as an omen, a sign from the gods seeking to assist or warn mortals. To ignore these signs was to court disaster. When Charicles' strategy of evacuating the countryside during the Peloponnesian War led to the occupation of land deemed sacred, an oracle had explicitly warned against it. The subsequent outbreak of plague was seen not as a failure of strategy, but as divine retribution for ignoring the god's word. The disastrous Athenian expedition to Sicily offers another grim illustration. The general Nicias, deeply religious, delayed his retreat for 27 days due to a lunar eclipse, which his seer interpreted as a sign to remain put. This fatal decision, dictated by a misinterpretation of divine portents, ultimately led to the annihilation of his army. The Greeks believed that the gods were deeply involved in every facet of human life, from sea voyages to battles, from moments of passion to the everyday act of planting seeds.
To secure their goodwill, a variety of actions were taken. The most direct methods involved making a votive dedication or performing a sacrifice, always accompanied by prayer. A votive offering could range from a simple terracotta figurine to a valuable bronze statue or even a commissioned hymn. Sacrifices, typically of animals like sheep, goats, or pigs, were common, with the savory smoke rising to the heavens considered a delicacy by the gods. The more generous the offering, the more likely the deity was to heed a prayer. Each god had a designated day, and on Athena's birthday, for instance, hundreds of oxen were sacrificed. Libations of wine, honey, or milk were also offered. The Greeks' relationship with their gods was, by modern standards, profoundly transactional. The gods, though physically perfect and immortal, were not inherently benevolent. They possessed human-like emotions, often displaying pettiness, vindictiveness, jealousy, and deceit. They acted primarily out of self-interest, and a crucial question for any supplicant was, how will they benefit from helping me? This utilitarian approach to the divine was captured by the inscription on a bronze figurine from Montiklos to Apollo, who shoots a long distance with his bow. Give me something nice in return. Religion, though pervasive, was not a codified system of morality. Piety, rather than good behavior, was the central aim. The gods were invoked to harm enemies as readily as to bestow benefits. This anthropomorphic view of deities also meant they could appreciate humor. Dionysus, for example, was expected to laugh at his own on-stage portrayal as a cowardly, incontinent figure in Aristophanes' play, Frogs. Beyond the Olympian gods, the Greeks also venerated chthonic deities, associated with the earth and the underworld, and heroes, individuals whose lives, for better or worse, had been exceptional. Heroes were believed to be powerful in the vicinity of their tombs and could be invoked for assistance during times of crisis through blood sacrifices. Ultimately, navigating the unknown in ancient Greece meant acknowledging the omnipresence of the divine. Whether through consulting oracles, interpreting signs, or performing rituals, the Athenians sought to align themselves with forces beyond their control, hoping to secure favorable intervention in a world where the gods, with all their human-like flaws and powers, were ever present.
Relaxation and entertainment, symposia, theater, and games. For the free-born Athenian man, leisure was not a luxury, but a fundamental aspect of his civic duty and a cornerstone of his identity. In an era without the internet, social media, or constant digital distraction, the Athenians cultivated rich traditions of relaxation and entertainment that were deeply interwoven with their social and cultural fabric. These activities, though primarily the domain of men, offered avenues for intellectual engagement, social bonding, and the pursuit of pleasure. The most intimate and significant of these gatherings was the symposium. Far more than just a drinking party, the symposium was a carefully orchestrated social event held in the andron, the designated men's room within a private home. The very act of reclining to drink, a practice borrowed from the East, signaled a departure from the day's work and a transition into a space of conversation and conviviality. A symposium was inherently a religious occasion, commencing with prayers and concluding with a hymn to Apollo, underscoring the Greeks' pervasive sense of the divine in all aspects of life. Central to the symposium's atmosphere was the controlled consumption of wine, always diluted with water. The symposiarch, a leader chosen for the occasion, dictated the ratio of wine to water, setting the tone and pace for the evening.
This careful moderation was essential, as undiluted wine was considered the mark of a barbarian and a sure path to madness. The symposium also served as a vital social and intellectual forum. It was here that ideas were exchanged, literature was discussed, and cultural knowledge was displayed. Games, such as katabos, where participants hurled the dregs of their wine at a target, provided a light-hearted diversion. However, it was the intellectual exchange that truly defined the symposium. The Greek proverb, "I hate a symposiast with a good memory," playfully hints at the discretion expected, where what happened within the symposium's walls remained within its walls. Crucially, symposia were exclusively for free-born men and heterai. Heterai, educated female companions, were valued for their wit, conversation, and artistic talents, often engaging with the most prominent figures in Athenian society. Wives and daughters were strictly excluded, reinforcing the patriarchal structure of the time. While a husband might not attend symposia every evening, his absence from the domestic sphere for these occasions was a recognized male prerogative, with wives expected to manage the household in his stead. Homosexuality, within specific contexts, was also a feature of symposia. Typically, these relationships were between a younger and an older man, with the older man acting as a mentor. These relationships were generally understood as episodic, not defining a person's entire sexuality, and were bound by strict laws against pederasty. Beyond the private sphere, the Athenians were renowned for their invention of drama, a form of public entertainment that held immense cultural significance. Festivals, particularly the city Dionysus and the Linnea, were dedicated to Dionysus, the god of wine and theater, and featured elaborate theatrical performances. Tragedies, often drawing on myths from the Trojan War, were exploring themes of familial conflict and the clash between the individual and the state, were presented in trilogies. Comedies, on the other hand, were contemporary and often politically charged, with playwrights like Aristophanes lampooning politicians and philosophers alike. The theater itself was a marvel of acoustic engineering, a vast open-air auditorium carved into the side of the Acropolis, ensuring that even those seated furthest away could clearly hear the actors. The performances, lasting for hours, were a communal experience, attended by thousands and deeply intertwined with civic identity. While women's attendance is uncertain, the sheer scale and impact of theater underscore its central role in Athenian life. Actors, highly skilled in changing characters and voices, performed wearing masks, and the audience's engagement could range from rapt attention to the pelting of performers with nuts and fruit if they deemed the performance subpar. Physical fitness was another valued aspect of male Athenian life, pursued in the gymnasium. These were places of rigorous exercise, where men trained naked, gymnasium deriving from the Greek word for nakedness. Beyond physical conditioning, gymnasia served as social hubs, spaces for conversation and intellectual discourse, with some even evolving into centers for philosophical schools. For women, opportunities for such public physical activity were largely non-existent, with the exception of Sparta, where girls underwent rigorous training. In essence, relaxation and entertainment in ancient Athens were not mere diversions, but integral components of a man's life, fostering intellectual growth, social cohesion, and a profound connection to cultural and religious traditions. While the opportunities for freeborn women and slaves were severely limited, the vibrant world of the symposium and the grandeur of the theater highlight the Athenian commitment to a life of engaged and cultivated leisure.
To be an Athenian citizen
was to be enmeshed in a vibrant, demanding, and participatory political life. Unlike modern nations, Greece was a collection of independent city-states, or polis, and your primary allegiance was to your own polis, be it Athens, Sparta, or Corinth. For those in Athens, citizenship was not a passive status. It was an active, lifelong commitment. It was conferred by birth, requiring both parents to be Athenian citizens. From a young age, boys were presented to their phratry, or brotherhood, and at 18, they underwent a review by the phratry members before being officially enrolled in their deme, or township, and assigned their full citizen name, X, son of Y, of the deme, Z. Beyond the deme and phratry, citizens were also divided into 10 artificial tribes, each playing a role in administrative divisions, military service, and social life. In Athens, citizenship meant participation in a radical, direct democracy. There was no government in our sense, no political parties, no elected president. Instead, every significant decision was made by a vote of the citizens themselves in the assembly. This made every vote a de facto referendum. All citizens enjoyed equality before the law, judged by juries composed of their peers, often numbering in the hundreds to prevent corruption. Service was an integral part of this civic duty. All citizens were required to serve in the military. Those who could afford it served as heavily armed hoplites, or hoplon. Those who could not afford armor served as rowers in the powerful Athenian navy, a vital component of Athens' maritime empire. Service was organized on a rotating basis among the 10 tribes, ensuring that citizens fought and served alongside the same comrades in various contexts, fostering discipline and morale. Athens stood apart in its openness to foreigners, known as metics. The city hosted around 20,000 metics, many residing in the bustling port of Piraeus. These individuals, hailing from across the Greek world and beyond, contributed significantly to Athens' culture and commerce. While they couldn't own property, they could establish cults for their own deities, and were expected to register with the eponymous archon within a month of arrival, paying a monthly tax. Failure to do so could result in deportation or enslavement. Despite this, metics generally experienced little prejudice, and many prospered, with roughly half the craftsmen working on major public projects like the Erytheum being metics. Their presence underscores Athens' unique cosmopolitanism in the Greek world. The political arena was the heart of Athenian civic life. Participation was not just permitted, but expected. Pericles famously stated, "We regard the man who takes no part in politics not as somebody who minds his own business, but as good for nothing." This condemnation of civic apathy highlights the profound importance placed on engagement. Meetings of the assembly, held 4 times a month on the Pnyx Hill, allowed any citizen to propose subjects for discussion, though the agenda was prepared by the Council of 500, whose members were chosen annually by lot. Leadership roles were also filled by lot, with magistrates known as archons overseeing various aspects of state affairs. While the epistates, or overseer, held a purely ceremonial one-day role, the eponymous archon lent his name to the year and managed affairs concerning metics. The king archon was responsible for religious observance, and other archons oversaw courts and subsidized dramatic festivals. While most officials were selected by lot, a few key positions, like the 10 strategoi,
or generals were elected by popular vote, acknowledging the need for expertise and experience in military leadership. A unique democratic safeguard was ostracism, or ostrakismos. Once a year, citizens voted on whether to exile a prominent individual for 10 years. This was not a punishment, but a mechanism to break political stalemates by removing individuals who had become too powerful or divisive. The process involved citizens writing the name of their chosen exile on a piece of broken pottery, an ostrakon. For citizens, the assembly, the council, jury service, military duty, and participation in festivals and local daime affairs constituted a full-time engagement. The emphasis was on active contribution and collective responsibility, a stark contrast to the passive citizenship of many modern societies. To be an Athenian citizen was to be a stakeholder in the destiny of the polis, an identity forged through active participation and unwavering civic duty.
In the complex tapestry of ancient Athenian life, duty to the state was not a choice, but a fundamental aspect of citizenship. For every freeborn male, military service was as expected as participation in the assembly or respect for the gods. This wasn't merely a civic obligation, it was a deeply ingrained aspect of identity, a privilege that reinforced one's place within the community. From the age of 18, a citizen was liable for conscription, a call to arms that could come at any time, serving with the same cadres of men encountered in everyday life. This shared experience forged strong bonds, crucial for discipline and morale in the often brutal realities of warfare. The nature of this service was to a significant degree dictated by one's economic standing. The most visually striking military force was the hoplite. These were the heavily armed infantry, distinguished by their substantial bronze shield, the hoplon, which gave them their name. To equip oneself as a hoplite demanded considerable investment: a helmet, greaves, breastplate, sword, and spear. This was a costly undertaking, usually only accessible to those who could afford to purchase or inherit such panoply. Hoplic service was not about individual acts of heroism, but about the unyielding strength of the phalanx. This tightly packed rectangular formation, several ranks deep, relied on discipline and cohesion. Each hoplite's shield, large enough to protect his left flank, also offered partial protection to the man beside him. To advance or retreat out of formation was to imperil not only oneself, but also one's comrades. Battles, fought with thrusting spears and, when spears broke, with swords, were typically short, rarely lasting more than an hour due to the sheer exhaustion of fighting in such heavy armor. The objective wasn't the annihilation of the enemy, but their rout through inflicted losses. After which, a trophy, a monument to victory, was erected from captured spoils. The fallen were cremated on the battlefield, their ashes returned to the city, a solemn remembrance of those who had made the ultimate sacrifice. For those unable to afford hoplite armor, the Navy offered the alternative of service as a rower. In an empire built on maritime power, the Navy was not merely a supplementary force, it was the very lifeblood of Athens. With a formidable fleet of around 250 triremes, the backbone of Athenian dominance rested on the strength and discipline of its rowers. A trireme, a marvel of swiftness and agility, carried approximately 170 rowers, supported by a complement of soldiers and sailors. Rowing in the Athenian Navy was no easy task. It demanded immense toughness and discipline. Each rower occupied a designated seat across 3 tiers, their oars extending out of the water. The top tier required the most skill and strength as the oars were positioned highest. When the rowing master commanded, rowers could propel the ship at speeds of 9 to 10 knots. These ships, financed by wealthy citizens known as triarchs, who competed to maintain their vessels in peak condition, were the instruments of Athenian power. Many rowers hailed from the port city of Piraeus, and their training involved not only rowing, but the essential repairs and maintenance needed to keep the fleet seaworthy throughout the year. The thrill of naval combat, the decisive moment of ramming an enemy ship with a bronze prow, or the tactical maneuver of smashing an opponent's oars, all contributed to the unique experience of a rower in the Athenian navy. These were the men, often from less privileged backgrounds, who powered the Athenian empire, their labor as vital to its survival as the courage of the hoplites on land.
In the bustling heart of Athens, maintaining order was a shared responsibility, a stark contrast to the centralized policing we know today. There was no formal police force in the modern sense. Instead, the city relied on its citizens to be its eyes and ears. Policing was largely a matter of neighborhood watch, a consequence of Athens being a face-to-face society, where familiarity bred vigilance. In this tightly knit community, a burglar would find it exceedingly difficult to escape detection. After all, it was in everyone's best interest to see criminals brought to justice, a shared goal that fostered a strong sense of community vigilance. This system meant that many disputes and wrongdoings were resolved within the community itself, often without ever reaching the formal legal system. The question of the crime rate in ancient Athens is, unfortunately, one that history cannot definitively answer. Statistics were not invented, and there was little consciousness of social trends. While Sparta, with its rigid social control, might be considered more law-abiding, it's crucial to remember the Spartan practice of publicly sanctioning the murder of helots. In Athens, surviving law court speeches often focus on white-collar crime, such as disputes over inheritance, rather than violent offenses. However, the absence of frequent mentions of violent crime in these records does not mean it didn't occur. Rather, it suggests that most such incidents were likely settled privately outside the courts. When a crime did necessitate legal intervention, the responsibility for bringing an action fell squarely on the shoulders of the victim. If the offense was against the state, however, any citizen was permitted to initiate proceedings. This was precisely how Socrates would eventually face trial, accused by 3 private individuals who claimed his teachings were injurious to the state. The process of going to trial began with the complainant appealing to one of the archons, the city's senior magistrates. If the archon deemed the charge to have merit, the defendant would be summoned and a trial date set. Crucially, unless caught in the act, the accused remained at liberty until their trial, regardless of the charge's severity. This often led to individuals fleeing abroad to escape potential conviction. For crimes not involving the state, Athens made no effort to apprehend such fugitives, adopting a general attitude of good riddance. The Athenian courtroom was a public spectacle, with trials often taking place in the open. Juries were remarkably large, sometimes comprising as many as 601 jurors. This immense size was intended as a deterrent against bribery and corruption. The plaintiff presented their case first, followed immediately by the defendant. Both parties were allocated an equal amount of time to make their arguments. Interestingly, there were no witnesses in the modern sense. However, statements taken in advance could be read aloud.
If a slave was compelled to give testimony, it was typically under torture, as torture was considered the best test of truth. The judge's role was purely supervisory, to conduct the proceedings and maintain order. The open-air setting meant that speakers often had to contend with heckling from onlookers, transforming the legal process into a form of spectator sport. Once both sides had spoken, the jurors would immediately cast their secret ballots. Deliberation was not a feature of the Athenian court system. Following the vote count, the verdict would be announced.
Getting around, travel within and beyond Athens. To traverse the landscape of ancient Athens is to understand a world where movement was both fundamental to its identity and governed by practical, often challenging realities. Whether navigating the bustling city center or venturing into the wider Attic countryside, or even contemplating journeys beyond its borders, the methods of travel, the infrastructure, and the inherent dangers all shaped the Athenian experience. Within the city of Athens itself, the primary arteries of movement were its roads, while a handful were paved, notably the Panathenaian Way, which snaked from the Double Gate through the Agora to the Acropolis. Most thoroughfares were simply beaten earth. These dusty tracks in summer transformed into muddy, treacherous paths in winter. Overturning or getting stuck was a frequent occurrence, leading to predictable traffic jams. For shorter distances, transporting goods and supplies relied heavily on the strength of slaves, who carried yokes laden with amphoras, the ubiquitous two-handled vessels used for storing everything from wine and olive oil to preserved fish and grains. The port of Piraeus, Athens' vital link to the wider world, was connected to the city by the so-called Hamaxitos, or cart road. This more substantial, though still unpaved, route spanned approximately 5 miles. It served as the main artery for the movement of goods and people between the bustling harbor and the urban center. The Piraeus itself, the foremost trading port of the classical world, was a hub of activity, boasting 3 harbors and handling immense volumes of both exports and imports. Journeys beyond the immediate confines of Athens into Attica presented a different set of challenges. The mountainous terrain of the Attic Peninsula, while contributing to the independent spirit of its city-states, also made overland travel arduous. Paved roads were scarce, primarily reserved for ceremonial processions, not for practical everyday transport. Most journeys involved traversing dirt tracks, where the constant danger of attack from footpads or wild animals was a stark reality. The incident involving Oedipus and Laius on the road from Delphi to Thebes, a tale of a chance encounter escalating into fatal violence, was not a mere fictional embellishment, but a reflection of the perilous nature of travel in the ancient world. For those who could afford it, oxen-drawn carts were the most efficient way to move heavy loads. But even these lumbering vehicles moved at a snail's pace, averaging only about 2 miles per hour. For women, travel was even more restricted. While men could walk and run for miles, women, mindful of social conventions, had to be far more circumspect. Hitching up their tunics and exposing their knees was generally unacceptable, limiting their mobility significantly, except in dire emergencies. This constraint underscored the patriarchal structure of Athenian society, where women's lives were largely confined to the domestic sphere. When venturing further afield, whether for trade, diplomacy, or pilgrimage, the sea was often the preferred and sometimes the only practical means of transport. Greek civilization was inherently a seafaring one, with an extensive network of connections between coastal communities. However, maritime travel was far from risk-free. Piracy was a perennial hazard, so much so that piracy was almost an accepted way of life. The fear of piracy was so profound that it influenced the very founding of Athens, which was established 5 miles inland from the coast. Furthermore, the Aegean Sea was notorious for its unpredictable weather, with sudden storms capable of overwhelming even the most robust vessels. The power of Poseidon, the god of the sea, was a constant and tangible threat,
a reality that any mariner would do well to respect through appropriate sacrifices and prayers before embarking on a voyage. Accommodations for travelers were also varied. In urban centers and ports, facilities often advertised themselves as hotels. However, these establishments were frequently home to an unpleasant array of unwelcome guests, including bedbugs, other crawling insects, and rats. In the countryside, formal hotels were virtually non-existent. This deficiency, to some extent, was mitigated by the strong Greek emphasis on hospitality, particularly among the aristocracy, where the institution of xenia, or guest friendship, provided a framework for safe and sustained travel. Through xenia, aristocrats could rely on the generosity of fellow elites, building enduring networks that facilitated both business and social connections across the Greek world. Even commoners, though to a lesser extent, could develop ties that allowed for more modest journeys. In essence, travel in ancient Greece, whether within the familiar confines of Athens or across the broader Hellenic landscape, demanded a combination of resilience, practicality, and an awareness of the ever-present dangers. It was a world where the simple act of moving from one place to another was an undertaking shaped by the ruggedness of the terrain, the societal norms, and the capricious will of the gods.
The life of an aristocratic woman in classical Athens was a highly structured one, meticulously designed to uphold family honor and societal expectations. From birth, her path was charted, its ultimate destination being marriage and the continuation of her family's lineage. Her world was primarily confined within the walls of her oikos, her household, where her duties and activities were strictly delineated. The ideal aristocratic Athenian woman was expected to be socially invisible. Pericles, in his famous speech for the war dead, encapsulated this ideal. A woman's greatest glory is to be talked about neither in praise nor in blame. This meant a life largely lived away from the public eye, a life of modesty and domesticity. She was discouraged from leaving her home unaccompanied, and even then her appearance was meant to be demure, often with her face veiled. Her education, if considered at all, was limited to the skills deemed necessary for managing a household: spinning, weaving, cooking, and the supervision of domestic slaves. While some aristocratic girls might receive rudimentary literacy, it was not a priority, and their intellectual development was not pursued with the same vigor as that of their male counterparts. The primary purpose of an aristocratic girl's existence, from the perspective of her family and society, was to secure a good marriage. Marriage was not a matter of personal choice or romantic love, but a strategic alliance between families, primarily concerned with the transfer of property and the continuation of the oikos. Girls were typically married at the onset of puberty, often around the age of 13 or 14, to men considerably older, sometimes twice their age. These unions were arranged by fathers or legal guardians, with the bride's consent neither sought nor required. The betrothal itself was a significant event, where the father or guardian promised his daughter for the plowing of children, a starkly utilitarian phrase that highlighted the central role of procreation. The wedding ceremony was a ritualistic affair, marking the formal transition of the girl into her husband's household. After ritual purification and a feast, she would be conveyed to her new home, placed under the protection of household deities, signifying her incorporation into her husband's family. However, for the young bride, this transition was often fraught with anxiety. She had met her husband-to-be only a few times, knew little about him, and faced the prospect of her first sexual experience with a stranger, a moment often compared to the abduction of Persephone into the underworld. Once married, the aristocratic woman's life continued to be largely confined. Her days were occupied with the management of the household, overseeing slaves, supervising children, and engaging in domestic crafts like spinning and weaving. While her husband might spend his days in the agora or engage in public affairs, her world remained within the domestic sphere.
Her husband was considered the head of the household, and she was expected to defer to his authority. The concept of infidelity was governed by a strict double standard. While he could engage in relationships with women outside the marriage, her fidelity was paramount. Adultery on her part carried severe penalties, including social ostracization and potential legal repercussions for her family. Despite these restrictions, life for an aristocratic girl was not entirely devoid of social interaction or even agency, albeit within prescribed limits. Festivals provided rare opportunities for women to gather, engage with each other, and importantly, for aristocratic girls like Hippoclea to participate in important civic and religious roles. Hippoclea, at just 12 years old, was already aware of her family's noble lineage, her father's wealth, and her own attractiveness, which had already garnered marriage proposals. She spoke of the ancient myths that shaped her understanding of Athenian society and her own place within it. From the sacrifice of Erechtheus's daughters for the good of Athens to the ritualistic purification at the sanctuary of Artemis in Brauron, where young girls played the role of bears to appease the goddess before marriage. These traditions underscored the importance of lineage, piety, and the ultimate duty of women to ensure the continuation of their families. Her family's status as Etioboutads, a noble Gainos, meant she was expected to uphold a certain standard. She understood the political machinations of Athenian society through her father's disdain for democracy and his friendships with Spartans and the prominence of figures like Alcibiades. Her education, while limited, was steeped in the stories and traditions that defined her aristocratic identity. She was destined to be a kanephoros, a basket-bearer for Athena at the Panathenaea festival, a prestigious role that highlighted the religious significance of her position within society. In essence, the life of an aristocratic Athenian girl was one of privilege, yet deeply constrained by societal expectations and ancient traditions. Her value was primarily defined by her family's status and her ability to fulfill her role as a wife and mother, ensuring the perpetuation of Athenian noble lineages. Her existence was a delicate balance between inherited wealth and social confinement, with her public life subsumed by her private domestic duties, all in service of her oikos and the wider polis.
In the landscape of ancient Greece, where societal structures were rigidly defined and economic realities often harsh, the position of a widow presented a unique and often precarious existence. Phainarete, a woman who found herself in this situation, offers a poignant testament to the challenges faced. Her husband, Timon, a wealthy owner of a shield factory, met a tragic end when the roof of his workshop, overburdened with shields, collapsed. Timon's death was not swift. He endured days of agony, his chest crushed, a suffering that likely mirrored the immense emotional and financial strain on Phainarete. Timon, as described by Phainarete, was a man of industry and good standing. He was diligent in his work, an upright citizen, and a provider for his family. Of their 9 children, 4 had survived infancy, the youngest, Archippe, being only 2 years old at the time of his death. Their household was supported by 4 slaves, a common provision for a family of their means, tasked with domestic duties and farm labor. Phainarete noted that Timon was not prone to infidelity with his slaves, a sentiment colored by the understanding that favorite slaves might grow uppity. While his activities outside the home were a separate matter, his return to their shared hearth each night, even if occasionally the worse for the wear, provided a semblance of stability. The true extent of Phainarete's hardship became apparent upon Timon's demise. She discovered that he had incurred significant debts to his bronze supplier. His inability to settle these debts stemmed from a delay in payment for a recent consignment of shields. Crucially,
the purchaser of these shields, upon learning of Timon's death, refused to honor their account. This refusal left Phainarete in an extraordinarily vulnerable position. As a widow, she was described as the weakest of the weak, lacking the legal standing or protective kinship ties to pursue redress. Her parents were deceased, and she had no brothers or uncles to champion her cause. The immediate consequence of this financial ruin was the sale of most of Timon's savings to satisfy the bronze supplier. The family home had to be sold, forcing Phainarete to seek refuge with her aunt Nicagora, herself a widow. Together, they faced the daunting task of raising 8 children. Nicagora, to survive, made wicker baskets and dyed ribbons for funerary adornments and temple decorations, a testament to the resourcefulness required for even a basic livelihood. Phainarete, at 30 years old, articulated her deepest hope: to live long enough to see all her daughters married. The prospect of providing dowries for them all seemed insurmountable. Her physical recovery from her last pregnancy, which resulted in a stillborn child and a severe infection that nearly claimed her life, was incomplete, further compounding her difficulties. Despite the immense suffering, Phainarete's perspective, shaped by her cultural context, acknowledged the role of the gods and fate. She recalled the Homeric concept of Zeus's 2 jars, one of good fortune and the other of bad, and expressed gratitude for a mixture of both. Her lucky status, in her view, derived from a happy childhood, a happy marriage, and the survival of 4 healthy children. This sentiment underscores a deep-seated resilience, a capacity to find solace and meaning even amidst profound adversity. The ability to sacrifice and pray, to maintain a connection with the divine, was seen as a pathway to enduring whatever trials life presented. The account of Phainarete starkly illustrates the economic vulnerability of widows in ancient Greece. Without a male protector or significant personal wealth, they faced immense challenges in maintaining their household and securing the future of their children. Their resilience was not merely a personal trait, but a societal necessity, a demonstration of the strength required to navigate a world that offered little safety net for those who lost their male guardians.
The politician: ambition, rhetoric, and civic life. In the vibrant heart of ancient Athens, civic life was not merely a spectator sport. It was a dynamic, often boisterous arena where ambition, persuasion, and the very fabric of society were debated and decided. At the center of this pulsating public sphere stood the politician, a figure both revered and scrutinized, whose currency was words and whose aspiration was influence. To understand the politician is to understand the Athenian ideal of citizenship, the power of rhetoric, and the relentless pursuit of public favor. Athenian democracy, at its most radical, was a direct democracy. Every male citizen, upon reaching maturity, had the right, indeed the expectation, to participate in the assembly. This was no distant parliament. It was a gathering of thousands on a hill called the Pnyx, where every vote was a referendum, every voice potentially impactful. But how did one rise to prominence in such a system? It was not through inherited titles or appointed office, for most positions were filled by lot. Instead, it was through the masterful deployment of rhetoric, the art of persuasion, that a citizen could capture the attention of the demos, the people. The political arena demanded more than just good intentions. It required a sharp mind, a commanding presence, and an even sharper tongue. This is where the influence of sophists, itinerant teachers of rhetoric, becomes apparent.
For a fee, they would train young men in the art of argumentation, equipping them with the skills to make the weaker argument appear the more convincing. This approach, while effective, drew sharp criticism. Socrates, the perennial questioner, famously derided sophists for their focus on profit over truth, a prejudice that, perhaps unfairly, has colored our view of their contribution to education. Yet for the aspiring politician, mastering rhetoric was not a luxury, but a necessity. It was the key to swaying the assembly, to winning legal battles, and ultimately to shaping the destiny of Athens. The lives of prominent politicians like Pericles illustrate this. Revered as the Olympian for his dignified demeanor, Pericles held sway for nearly 20 years. His pronouncements, delivered with unwavering confidence, could guide the city's course. He famously declared that a citizen who took no part in politics was good for nothing. This sentiment underscores the Athenian view that civic engagement was not optional, but a fundamental duty. However, even a figure as esteemed as Pericles was not immune to the machinations of politics. His ambition and his policies, particularly his steadfast resolve in the face of the Peloponnesian War, ultimately made him a victim of the very plague that ravaged Athens. The irony, as the text notes, was that his rhetoric, his confidence in Athens' might, may have contributed to the conditions that led to his demise. The ambition of politicians was often fueled by their personal wealth. In a society where significant public service often required personal investment, such as financing a trireme or equipping a dramatic chorus, wealth provided a distinct advantage. Diogenes, a politician himself, readily admits that his family's wealth facilitated his career. This financial advantage allowed him to gain attention, to have his voice heard, and to build a base of supporters. Yet he also acknowledges the immense pressure and the profound sense of public duty that came with it. He recounts his early days, trembling before the assembly, and the invaluable advice he received to focus on a distant point, to ignore the hecklers, and to speak his truth. The political landscape was not without its controversies. Demagogues, men who stirred up the masses through fiery oratory with little regard for principles, were a constant feature. Cleon, the son of a tanner, is described as a smelly but effective rabble-rouser. His willingness to challenge established figures like Nicias, the respected general, and his unexpected success in capturing Spartans on Sphacteria illustrate the unpredictability of Athenian politics. These figures, driven by ambition and a keen understanding of popular sentiment, could rise to power, even if their motives were suspect. But the politician's role was not solely about wielding power. It was also about embodying civic virtue, at least in the idealized view. Pericles' legacy was built on a foundation of what was perceived as selfless patriotism. Yet even he faced accusations of corruption, a testament to the constant scrutiny politicians endured. The public demanded integrity, and any hint of impropriety could be politically ruinous. The Athenians, for all their democratic ideals, were keenly aware of the human frailties that could infect those in power. The pursuit of political influence was a precarious balancing act. Ostracism, a unique Athenian practice, allowed citizens to exile a prominent individual for 10 years through a vote on pottery shards. This was not a punishment, but a negative popularity contest, a mechanism to break political stalemates and prevent any one individual from accumulating too much power.
It served as a constant reminder to politicians that their standing with the demos was their ultimate, and often fragile, source of authority. In essence, the politician in ancient Athens was a complex figure, shaped by ambition, honed by rhetoric, and constantly accountable to the citizen body. Their success depended on their ability to connect with the people, to persuade them, and to navigate the intricate currents of civic life. They were the embodiment of the Athenian experiment in self-government, where the power of the word, wielded with skill and conviction, could literally shape the world.
The victim of crime. The dangers of urban living. Life in the bustling heart of ancient Athens, while vibrant and culturally rich, was not without its perils. The dense urban environment, with its narrow, winding streets, the constant presence of animals, and the sheer concentration of people, created a fertile ground for a variety of dangers, particularly for the unsuspecting or vulnerable. While the majestic temples and public spaces spoke of Athenian achievement, the less visible aspects of city living presented a constant threat. One of the most immediate dangers was the pervasive issue of waste. With limited effective drainage systems, particularly the inadequacies of the Great Drain in handling the city's output, refuse accumulated on street corners. The stench, especially in warmer months, was often intolerable. Heavy rains could turn streets into channels for infected sewage, a stark reminder of the rudimentary understanding of sanitation. While dung collectors existed, their efforts were insufficient to manage the scale of the problem, largely leaving the responsibility for waste disposal to individuals. This accumulation of filth, coupled with the fear of miasma, ritual pollution believed to spread like contagion, highlighted a nascent, if imperfect, awareness of the risks of contagion. The practice of burying the dead outside the city walls was a direct consequence of this fear, underscoring the belief that even contact with a corpse could transmit dangerous pollution. When it came to law and order, Athenians could not rely on a robust police force. The small contingent of Scythian slaves served more to maintain general order at public gatherings than to prevent or investigate crime. Policing, in essence, was a community affair, carried out by ordinary citizens in their own neighborhoods. While this decentralized approach proved surprisingly effective in detecting crime, the methods of dealing with apprehended offenders were often described as rough and ready. The lack of street lighting meant that venturing out at night was inherently risky. It was strongly advised that one should not venture out at night without the accompaniment of a slave bearing a torch for protection, illustrating the profound vulnerability that darkness imposed. Fires were a common occurrence, and the absence of a fire brigade meant that small fires could quickly escalate into major disasters. Natural hazards like earthquakes also presented a persistent threat. The pervasive lack of understanding regarding hygiene was a significant contributor to the prevalence of illness. Water supplies were frequently contaminated, and when Athens evacuated its rural population during the Peloponnesian War, doubling the city's density, the resulting insanitary conditions likely contributed to the devastating plague that wiped out a third of the population. Deaths during childbirth were also alarmingly common, as were neonatal deaths, with approximately 1 in 3 infants succumbing within their first year of life. This grim reality meant that life expectancy was considerably shorter than in modern times, with roughly half the population dying by the age of 40. For those who found themselves on the wrong side of the law or who became victims of crime, the justice system offered little in the way of immediate protection. There were no public prosecutors. The responsibility for bringing an action rested with the victim or any concerned citizen for crimes against the state. While magistrates would summon defendants and assign trial dates, accused individuals, unless caught red-handed, remained at liberty until their trial. Many used this period to flee abroad, as no effort would be made to apprehend them. Trials themselves were often public spectacles with large juries. Slave testimony was often extracted under torture, considered the best test of truth. The absence of a public prison system meant that only those deemed a flight risk, like Socrates, would be incarcerated, and only briefly before their execution. The financial penalty for malicious prosecution, if the plaintiff failed to secure 1/5 of the jury's votes, was a significant deterrent, but it also meant that many crimes went unaddressed if the victim lacked the means or will to pursue a case. The case of Autocrates, a victim of crime himself, vividly illustrates these dangers. Mugged in the agora, he suffered a broken leg and the loss of his life savings. His inability to afford proper medical treatment resulted in a permanent limp, effectively ending his earning potential. While he was eventually successful in his prosecution of the father and son who attacked him, thanks to diligent collection of evidence and the jury's perception of his character versus the defendant's, the ordeal itself highlights the personal cost and the inherent difficulties faced by ordinary citizens. His wish to have lived in Sparta, a society he perceived as more law-abiding, speaks volumes about the perceived deficiencies in Athenian order. Ultimately, the urban environment of ancient Athens, while offering opportunities for commerce, culture, and civic participation, also presented a landscape fraught with dangers. From the ever-present threat of disease and the consequences of poor sanitation to the limitations of the legal system and the inherent vulnerability of its inhabitants, surviving in the city required a constant awareness of one's surroundings and a resilient spirit. The victim of crime in ancient Athens was often left to navigate a treacherous path with little support, a testament to the raw, unvarnished reality of life in the classical world.
The aspiring philosopher, the search for knowledge. In the vibrant intellectual landscape of ancient Greece, a specific kind of individual emerged, the aspiring philosopher. Driven by an insatiable curiosity and a desire to understand the fundamental nature of reality, these thinkers sought knowledge not through divine revelation or inherited wisdom alone, but through reason, observation, and rigorous debate. Their quest for truth, often conducted in the bustling public spaces of Athens, laid the groundwork for much of Western thought. The origins of this intellectual pursuit can be traced back to the Ionian cities on the coast of modern-day Turkey. Here, figures like Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes, centuries before your arrival, began to question the traditional explanations for the cosmos. Thales, looking for the fundamental element of all existence, concluded it was water, a substance essential for all life. Anaximander proposed a more abstract concept, the apeiron, the limitless or unbounded, as the source of everything, while Anaximenes championed air. These early inquiries, though seemingly simple, represented a revolutionary shift, the move from mythological explanations to rational, observable ones. This philosophical journey continued and evolved. Heraclitus of Ephesus famously declared that everything flows, emphasizing the constant state of change in the universe, famously illustrating this with the idea that one cannot step into the same river twice. In contrast, Parmenides of Elea argued for an unchanging singular reality, asserting that what exists cannot be created from nothing and is therefore indestructible. These opposing viewpoints, debated with vigor, fueled the intellectual engine of Greek thought. When you arrive in Athens, the philosophical scene is dynamic, though the nature of philosophical inquiry has begun to shift. The focus, for many, is no longer solely on the natural world, but increasingly on human affairs, ethics, and the art of persuasion. This change is largely attributed to the advent of the sophists.
These itinerant teachers, like Protagoras of Abdera, made their living by offering instruction in rhetoric and argumentation. They challenged the certainty of knowledge, famously suggesting that since we cannot know anything for sure, we might as well focus on achieving success through skillful debate. Protagoras' declaration that man is the measure of all things encapsulates this anthropocentric and relativistic view. However, not all were captivated by the sophists' pragmatism. Socrates, a figure you will undoubtedly encounter, stands as a prominent counterpoint. Though often caricatured, Socrates' method, famously known as the Socratic method, involved relentless questioning. He would engage individuals in dialogue, probing their definitions and assumptions, often leading them to realize the limitations of their own understanding. His focus was on ethical inquiry, on defining concepts like piety and justice, on urging people to know thyself. Despite his profound influence, Socrates was often viewed with suspicion by the Athenian populace. His disdain for common opinion and his persistent questioning of authority made him a controversial figure, leading to charges of corrupting the youth and impiety, which ultimately resulted in his condemnation. The legacy of these philosophical inquiries is multifaceted. Philosophers like Democritus proposed an atomic theory of matter, suggesting that all existence is composed of indivisible particles. While this was a remarkably prescient idea, it was also a testament to the abstract nature of philosophical thought, as these atoms were imperceptible. The pursuit of knowledge, therefore, often involved grappling with concepts that were far removed from everyday experience, requiring a keen intellect and a willingness to engage in complex reasoning. For the aspiring philosopher, the public spaces of Athens, particularly the agora, served as both classroom and forum. Here, thinkers would gather, engage in discourse, and attract followers. Philosophers like the Stoics, who would later gather in the painted Stoa, exemplify this tradition of intellectual community. These discussions were not merely academic exercises, they were vital to the social and political life of the city, shaping opinions and influencing public discourse. The search for knowledge in ancient Greece was not a solitary pursuit. It was embedded, public activity, intrinsically linked to the civic life of Athens. The desire to understand the world, coupled with the tools of reason and debate, created an intellectual ferment that continues to resonate through the ages. The philosophers, with their probing questions and diverse theories, were not just thinkers, they were active participants in the ongoing Athenian experiment in democracy and culture, forever seeking to unravel the mysteries of existence.
In the bustling, often chaotic landscape of classical Athens, where public life dominated the discourse and the domestic sphere remained largely unseen, a unique group of women navigated a different path. They were known as hetaires, a term translating to female companions. They occupied a liminal space, distinct from the cloistered wives of Athenian citizens and the more overtly transactional pornai, or prostitutes. Sosippe, a Milesian call girl, offers us a glimpse into this world. She emphatically states, "I'm certainly not a pornai, a prostitute, and I wouldn't be seen dead in a brothel. I'm a hetaira, a companion." This distinction is crucial. While sex might have been part of the arrangement, it was not the sole or primary service offered. Hetaires were hired for their companionship, skill in conversation, good looks, and wit. The book highlights that hetaires were, in essence, educated women. Sosippe boasts, "I know how to converse intelligently about any subject under the sun. Politics, literature, art, the gods, you name it. I can even give philosophers a run for their money when it comes to talking about what the universe is made of.
I also play the flute and dance in a way that will excite any man. This intellectual and artistic polish was precisely what set them apart and made them desirable company for Athenian men, particularly at symposia, the male drinking parties that formed a significant part of social life. These symposia were exclusive gatherings, as Sosipi explains. Permission to attend a symposium is restricted to freeborn men and hetaires. If you're a wife or daughter, sister or mother, grandmother or aunt or niece, you won't be welcome. This exclusion of respectable Athenian women from such social events underscored the hetaires' unique role. They were the only women permitted to participate in these discussions, adding a cultural and intellectual dimension to male camaraderie. Sosipi's own trajectory illustrates the allure and potential autonomy of this profession. Dissatisfied with a prearranged marriage to a rich farmer, but potentially brutal, she chose a different path. Fleeing to the port city of Miletus, famous for its hetaires, she found support and training from other women in the trade. Her journey to Athens, facilitated by a merchant who offered passage in exchange for sexual favors, was a calculated risk, a small price to pay for escaping a life of what she perceived as servitude and potential abuse. The life of a hetaira, however, was not without its complexities and social stigma. While educated and capable of earning substantial sums, they were also cut off from traditional family life and could not marry Athenian citizens. The offspring of a union between an Athenian and a hetaira, like Aspasia and Pericles, could not claim citizenship. Despite this, some hetaira, Sosipi, reflecting on the societal view of her profession, notes the jealousy of other women. A lot of women look down their noses at hetaires because they see them as a threat to their identity. In my view, that's just plain jealousy. She contrasts this with the stifling domesticity faced by many Athenian wives, questioning, who wants to be stuck in the house all day long, waiting to be told what to do by a man who's old enough to be your father? There's got to be more to life than that. While some hetaires, like Sosipi, found a degree of independence and wealth, others might have found the profession less lucrative or even degrading. The book mentions that many female metics, or resident aliens, also worked as hetaires, often catering to clients who found them exotic and were willing to pay a premium. Philosophers, particularly Socrates, are noted as being particularly difficult companions at symposia. Sosipi observes, philosophers are the worst, by the way. They can't keep their dirty paws off you. She recounts an experience at a symposium hosted by the tragic poet Agathon, where Socrates, despite his disheveled appearance, dominated the conversation, leaving Sosipi to wonder about his pronouncements on love. The life of a hetaira, therefore, was a complex tapestry woven with threads of education, social interaction, financial independence, and a degree of social ostracism. They were women who, by necessity or choice, operated outside the conventional norms of Athenian society, offering a form of intellectual and social engagement that was otherwise unavailable to Athenian women within their rigidly defined domestic roles. They were companions, conversants, and artists, carving out a unique existence in the public and private spheres of ancient Greece. In the bustling heart of Athens, life was a tapestry woven with threads of privilege and hardship. While the city boasted grand temples and vibrant public spaces, a significant portion of its populace existed on the fringes, their stories often lost in the grand narrative. Among them was Makarios, a blind beggar, whose testimony offers a stark glimpse into the struggles of the poor. Makarios was not born into this life of destitution. He hailed from the eastern coast of Attica, from the Dame of Thoricus, a region known for its olive groves. His childhood was shattered by a devastating fire that claimed the lives of his parents when he was just 7. Raised by his aunt, he inherited a small olive farm, a meager inheritance that was further diminished by the ravages of war. When he returned after serving in the military, his trees, which took years to mature, were cut down. Ruined, Makarios was forced to sell what remained. Life in the city proved to be a harsh readjustment. The city's distractions and temptations, coupled with his own vulnerability, led him down a path of desperation. He turned to prostitution, a trade he found moderately successful due to his good looks. However, illness struck, leaving him with sores and blindness in one eye. He then moved to the Piraeus, the port city, where he eked out a living from sailors. Yet this too proved unsustainable, a source of unsavory encounters with patrons, particularly the Egyptians, whom he found both stingy and demanding. His last attempt at regular employment was as a laborer for a vase painter named Onesimus. For a mere obol a day, he performed menial tasks, washing brushes, tending the kiln, and cleaning up. But his declining eyesight became a liability. One fateful day, he smashed a vase commissioned by a wealthy client. Onesimus, understandably, dismissed him. Makarios became a burden, a risk he could no longer afford. This is how Makarios became a beggar. With nothing but the clothes on his back, he lived hand to mouth. The life of a beggar, he explains, is a constant fight for survival, a battle for territory. He eventually found a spot at the entrance to the Agora in the Piraeus, where he remains, defending his pitch against other beggars. He is still strong, he notes, grateful that the sickness did not rob him of his hands, a stark contrast to many others. His survival is made possible by Cleo, a woman who cares for him, bringing him food and wine each evening. Sometimes she stays, sharing his meager blanket. Makarios prays daily to Pochea, a humble spirit, a goddess who protects beggars. He sees her protection in the near misses, like the time a crippled beggar he had muscled out to this spot was crushed by a cart that narrowly missed him. Makarios' story is a poignant reminder of the precariousness of existence for the poor in ancient Athens. His journey from a landowner to a destitute beggar, marked by war, illness, and misfortune, highlights the lack of a social safety net. Without family support or state assistance, a single blow of fate could reduce a man to utter ruin. His life, though fraught with hardship, is a testament to resilience, a struggle for dignity in the face of overwhelming adversity. He is a voice from the margins, a testament to the enduring human spirit in the face of profound suffering.
We arrive now at a stark and brutal truth of ancient Greece, a truth that underscores the very foundations of its society and economy. The reality of enslavement, not as a distant abstract, but as a visceral experience. And for many, this experience began not with birth into bondage, but with the shattering violence of capture. Consider the fate of Bion, a merchant from Ephesus, whose life, like countless others, was irrevocably altered by the swift, brutal hand of piracy. Bion's testimony paints a chilling picture. His first voyage abroad,
a venture with his father from Ephesus, ended abruptly. After a successful trade in Syracuse, their ship, hugging the coast near Corcyra, was intercepted by a pirate vessel. Even the presence of Athenian triremes in a nearby harbor offered no protection. The pirates, merciless and efficient, boarded their merchant ship, threw Bion and his father into irons, and sailed for Epirus, a known hub for the slave trade. This was the terrifying dawn of enslavement for Bion. Separated from his father at the slave market, he never saw him again. His thoughts turned to his mother back home, her anxiety growing with each passing day, her hope ultimately fading into the despair of never seeing her family return. This separation, this tearing apart of families, was not an anomaly. It was a horrifyingly common consequence of capture. The slave market itself was a place of profound dehumanization. Bion describes the scene. Thousands of individuals, categorized by sex, age, looks, education, and ethnicity. He, being literate and presentable, was herded into a pen with others deemed valuable. The young Thracian girl, fetching 165 drachmas. The Carian boy sold for 174. These were astronomical sums to the average citizen, for whom a daily wage might be a single drachma. This starkly illustrates the immense economic value placed on human beings. The process of inspection itself was a violation. Bion was forced to strip, given only a loincloth, and made to stand on a platform, turning slowly, arms outstretched. Potential buyers prodded him, examined his teeth, stroked his leg. This was not the inspection of a person, but of livestock, of chattel. He was reduced to an object, his recent status as a free man, a distant, cruel memory. The buyer, a Corinthian named Apharius, acquired Bion along with 7 other slaves for a significant sum. The journey to Corinth took nearly a month, fraught with peril. A squall forced them to land in Acarnania, requiring repairs. They navigated the Gulf of Corinth, and the ship was even hauled across the isthmus via a paved track known as the Diolkos. By the time they reached the port of Lycaon, the days were shortening, marking the progression into autumn. Bion's initial experience with his new owner, Apharius, was relatively benign. Apharius, a former Corinthian general, was a man of learning, engaged in writing a history of Corinth. Bion, being literate, was employed in scribal duties, dictating for hours on end. He received decent food and was allowed to sleep in the house, his mistress largely leaving him alone. His owner even articulated a sentiment of shared fortune, suggesting that life's circumstances often boil down to fate. However, this fragile stability was shattered by Apharius's death. His widow's subsequent illness and the ascent of their spoiled 16-year-old son, Thebrakos, marked a drastic decline in Bion's fortunes. Thebrakos, with no appreciation for literature, relegated Bion to the fields, assigning him the most arduous tasks, even forcing him to sleep in a leg iron at night. This harsh treatment, a stark contrast to his previous comfortable life, illustrates the capricious nature of enslavement. Faced with this brutal reality, Bion made a desperate decision: to escape. He seized the opportunity while working in the fields, running off into the wilderness. Thebrakos unleashed his dogs, but Bion evaded them by wading into a river. After hiding for a few days, he made his way back to Lycaon, stealing some of his mistress's jewelry and purchasing a chiton to disguise himself as a free citizen, hoping to secure passage back to Ephesus. His fate beyond this point remains unknown, a testament to the pervasive uncertainty faced by those in bondage. The capture and sale of individuals like Bion were not isolated incidents. Pirates preyed on maritime routes, and warfare was a constant source of human chattel. When cities were conquered, their populations often faced enslavement. The treatment of prisoners of war was notoriously harsh. As the text states, the Athenians hate the Persians for destroying their city, but don't assume that they hate them for being Persians. Though Greeks generally look down on non-Greeks and assume that their culture is superior, there's no convincing evidence that they're infected by our color-based racism. This highlights that enslavement was not inherently racial, but a consequence of capture, circumstance, and power. The brutality of capture extended beyond the initial act of seizure. It involved the forced separation from loved ones, the public auction, the commodification of human life, and the subsequent descent into a world of constant labor, uncertainty, and potential abuse. It was a process designed to strip individuals of their identity, their freedom, and their dignity, reducing them to mere property, to breathing property, as Aristotle disturbingly termed it. The testimony of Bion is a raw and poignant reminder of this brutal reality, a vital, albeit grim, piece of the ancient Greek experience.
In the stark, mountainous landscape of Laconia, a very different form of life took root, one forged in the crucible of constant military readiness and an unwavering commitment to the state. This was Sparta, and at its heart stood the hoplite, the citizen soldier whose existence was inextricably bound to duty and an almost unimaginable level of discipline. Unlike the vibrant, often chaotic democracy of Athens, Sparta presented a society that was, in many ways, the polar opposite, inward-looking, conservative, and utterly devoted to military prowess. To understand the Spartan hoplite is to understand the Spartan way of life, known as the agoge. From the moment of birth, a Spartan male was not truly his own. Newborns were inspected by the elders of the tribes, and those deemed imperfect, unfit for the rigorous demands of Spartan society, were abandoned to the harsh elements on Mount Taygetus. This was not a matter of cruelty, but a grim pragmatism born from a belief that a flawed individual was a burden to the state. Survival of the fittest, in its most literal sense, was the guiding principle. At the age of 7, a Spartan boy was taken from his family and placed under the care of an older youth. His education, or rather his upbringing, was entirely the responsibility of the state. The focus was singular, to mold him into a hardened brute capable of enduring immense pain and inflicting it upon others when commanded. This wasn't about intellectual pursuit. It was about obedience, endurance, and the absolute subjugation of the individual to the collective. Spartan youths graduated from the Krypteia, a form of secret police, around the age of 20, becoming full citizens known as homoi, or equals. This equality, however, was not in privilege, but in shared service and sacrifice. Their first commitment was to their messmates, the men with whom they trained, fought, and lived. Marriage itself was a transient affair. Spartan bridegrooms would spend only a short time with their new wives before returning to the company of their comrades. The Spartan hoplite was a formidable figure. Clad in bronze armor, a helmet, greaves, and a breastplate, a sword, and a spear. His most distinctive piece of equipment, and the very word from which hoplite derives, was the hoplon, a large, round shield. This shield was more than just a defensive item. It was a symbol of solidarity. It was large enough to protect not only the wearer, but also the soldiers standing to his left. Thus, maintaining formation was paramount.
To flee and abandon one's shield was the ultimate disgrace, a fate worse than death, as encapsulated by the legendary Spartan mother's admonishment, "With your shield or on it." The Spartans' attire was also indicative of their practical, no-nonsense approach. Their cloaks were dyed a dark red, chosen deliberately so that bloodstains from wounds would not be visible. This was not a matter of vanity, but a stark practicality that conveyed their readiness for battle and their acceptance of its grim realities. Spartan mothers, it is said, would give their sons a shield and tell them to return with it or be carried back dead upon it. This ethos of absolute dedication to the state permeated every aspect of their lives, from the cradle to the grave. This rigid social structure and military focus meant that Sparta was a place where dissent was severely censored. Critiquing the monarchy, the social system, or the constitution was simply not tolerated. While Athens boasted of its open society and welcome to foreigners, Sparta actively discouraged outsiders from entering its territory, fostering an intense xenophobia. Their watchword, eunomia, obedience to the law, was enforced with an iron fist, leading to a society that, while orderly, was also profoundly repressive. In contrast to the Athenian emphasis on rhetoric, intellectual debate, and individual expression, the Spartans valued laconic speech, brief, to the point, and devoid of unnecessary sentiment. While Athenians might spend hours in the agora debating philosophy and politics, Spartans focused on action and practical application. Their education, or lack thereof in the Athenian sense, was a deliberate choice. Reading and writing were not considered essential skills, as intellectual pursuits were seen as a distraction from their primary duty, military service. For Spartans, the company of their fellow soldiers and the exchange of stories about Spartan valor held far more value than solitary study. The result of this relentless focus on military discipline was a fighting force that inspired awe and terror throughout the Greek world. Even the Athenians, for all their pride and military might, held the Spartans in a certain respect, albeit the grudging one. The Spartan hoplite was not just a soldier, he was a living embodiment of his state's ideals. His life was a testament to the Spartan belief that the collective good, embodied by the state, superseded all individual desires and freedoms. Duty, discipline, and a willingness to die for Sparta were not abstract concepts. They were the very fabric of existence for the Spartan hoplite, defining his identity from the moment of his rigorous birth to his battlefield demise.
The helot, the unseen backbone of Spartan society. To understand Sparta, one must understand the enslaved population that fueled its unique, militaristic society. These were not chattel slaves in the traditional sense. They were the helots, the bedrock upon which Spartan dominance was built, and a constant source of anxiety for their masters. Helots were a conquered people, originally from the region of Messenia, whose homeland had been subjugated by the Spartans centuries prior. Unlike slaves captured in war or born into servitude elsewhere in the Greek world, Helots retained a distinct ethnic identity. They had their own traditions, their own ancestral gods, and their own history. A history that fueled a deep-seated resentment and a yearning for freedom. This shared identity and the memory of a once free people was a potent force that the Spartans both feared and exploited. The Helots were bound to the land, their primary role being to cultivate the agricultural estates that supported the Spartan citizen body, the Spartiates.
While the Spartiates were a warrior class, living a life of rigorous training and military discipline, the Helots toiled in the fields, raising crops and tending livestock. They lived under a system of Spartan oversight, barely receiving enough food to sustain their families, yet left largely to manage their own lives in the intervals between Spartan demands. This arrangement, however, was fraught with tension. The Spartans lived in constant fear of Helot revolt. Their military prowess, their famed discipline and martial skill was not just for external defense, it was a crucial mechanism for internal control. The very structure of Spartan society was geared towards suppressing any hint of Helot uprising. This fear manifested in chilling ways. The Spartans, in their paranoia, formally declared war on the Helots every year. This was not a war fought with armies and pitched battles, but a ritualized act of terror. The Krypteia, or the secret police, comprised young Spartan males who, as part of their military training, would descend into the Messenian countryside. They lived in the wild, attacking Helots without warning. They could steal belongings, burn houses, abduct children, and commit acts of violence with impunity. The explicit purpose of the Krypteia was to terrorize the Helot population, to instill a constant dread that would hopefully prevent any organized resistance. The Helots, despite this brutal oppression, harbored a potent, albeit suppressed, sense of pride in their ancestry. They passed down stories of their former freedom and whispered of a future day when they would rise up and reclaim their land. This memory, nurtured across generations, was a constant ember of defiance. The Spartans, in their drive for military supremacy, relied heavily on the Helots not just for labor, but also to contribute to their fighting force. While often unarmed and forced into subservient roles, a number of Helots were trained to fight. The historical accounts of the Battle of Thermopylae, for instance, a battle often portrayed as a purely Spartan triumph, omit the crucial fact that a significant contingent of Helots fought alongside the 300 Spartiates. It is suggested that without these Helots, the Spartans would have been annihilated on the very first day of the conflict. Yet Spartan propaganda worked to erase their contribution, casting the battle as a singularly Spartan victory. The Helots' existence was a paradox. They were the unacknowledged backbone of Spartan society, performing the essential labor that freed the Spartiates for their military pursuits. They were also a permanent threat, a restless underclass whose potential for rebellion shaped every aspect of Spartan life, from their social structure to their rigorous military training. Their subjugation was the price of Spartan power, a grim testament to the exploitation that underpinned one of ancient Greece's most formidable city-states.